Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Abralin ao Vivo event. It's great to be with you again. I'm Selene Rodrigues from PUC Rio. Thanks to a pool of linguistic associations and societies, including Abralin, we have had the opportunity to interact with amazing researchers. Also, the many lectures and roundtables that compose Abralin ao Vivo are a gift we will leave for our future generations. I'm really thankful to everybody involved in this project. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting a lecture by Professor David Lightfoot from Georgetown University. Dr. Lightfoot will talk about language acquisition, and the title of his talk is Born to Parse, How Children Invent Variable Properties. While listening to this talk, I want all of you, especially Brazilians, to do me a favor. Please reflect upon the fact that every child in this world has the right to acquire and preserve her native language. We must do everything we can to ensure that this will happen. Also, diversity is crucial for the survival of our species. But many of our native tribes are now facing death at the present moment, and consequently, their languages are on the path of extinction. We cannot let it happen. Let me introduce you Professor David Lightfoot. David has a genuine talent for connecting facts from different areas within linguistics. Throughout his career, he has advanced our knowledge of human language by studying how language variation and language change are related to language acquisition. He has many important publications in this arena of research, including the books The Language Lottery, Principles of Diachronic Syntax, The Development of Language Change, How to Set Parameters, Argument from Language Change, and now his brand new book called Born to Parse, How Children Select Their Languages, which I believe he will talk about this evening. Now, David's talent to act as a connector can also be appreciated during a soccer game. He knows how to plan a fast and stylish counterattack during a match. I did try to learn how to play soccer from him while we were both at the University of Maryland. Professor David Lightfoot, many thanks for being with us today. I do hope you will enjoy and cherish this moment as much as we will. Thank you.
So I am now, I'm sharing the screen, right?
Not yet, David. Go to share screen. Now it's working. Thank you.
Okay, so we're set?
Yes.
All right, so let's start with the most important thing, and that's to thank and congratulate Aberdeen for its wisdom and opportunism in taking in what in many ways is a bad situation and finding ways to do good things, like putting together this wonderful lecture series. So thank you. And your timing could not have been better as far as I am concerned, because when I heard about this, I had been working on a new book, Rethinking Variable Properties. So that is to say, properties that show up just in some languages, but not all languages, to rethink the nature of those properties and the way in which they are acquired. So that book is now almost complete. It should be being packed up into parcels to be sent around the world, and that will happen in a couple of weeks next month. The basic argument of the book is that fish are born to swim, certain birds are born to chirp, and humans in the same sense are born to parse. That is to say, to assign linguistic structure to what they hear. And this is a fundamental property of our species and one of the key things that makes our species unique. I've also written this book under the influence of the Minimalist program. So the Minimalist program has takes work on invariant properties of language and tries to simplify our accounts so that the accounts become evolutionarily plausible. So the contribution that the book is making to those minimalist aspirations is that we are getting rid of parameters. There are no parameters at by the time you get to the end of the book. There is no evaluation metric which ranks grammars against each other, arguing that one grammar is superior to the others. And there is no parser, that is to say, no independent mechanism to characterize the person's ability to parse. So in that sense, we are simplifying universal grammar in a way that presumably will be welcomed by minimalists. My aim this afternoon is to try to convey these basic ideas. It's a short way of reading the book. We'll do this in an hour. And I am hoping that people who are listening who have very little background in the field will learn why it is that some of us have devoted our lives to trying to understand scientifically this most human of attributes. And what I'm going to be advocating is a new approach to the way in which we think about variable properties and to the way in which we think about their acquisition. And that will mean working in a new paradigm and rethinking many aspects of work that's been done on change, on childhood acquisition, and so forth. So for many decades, I'm not advancing my slides. Selene?
David,
Can you please click on the slide?
Yes.
With the mouse, can you click on
Yes.
it?
Yes.
And try to.
There we go.
Okay,
There
good.
we go.
So you can move with your keyboard.
Yes.
The arrows in the keyboard. Okay.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. So for many decades now, generative linguists have been working on invariant principles, which do not vary from one particular language to another. And over the course of work in the last few years, minimalists have postulated computational operations of project and merge that build hierarchical structures bottom up and combine two elements, a head and a complement, or a phrasal category and an adjunct phrase. These two skeletal structures suffice for all languages when they're supplemented by the results of parsing external language. That is to say, when they're supplemented by things that are learned by children. So one possibility is that we have structures consisting of heads and complements. So there's a verb saw, which is a head projecting to a verb phrase. And the complement of that verb saw is the determiner phrase, a man with a jacket. So there's the structure for I saw a man with a jacket, consisting of a series of heads and complements. The alternative structure for different expressions is one where adjuncts show up. So I saw a woman in Los Angeles. The seeing of a woman took place in Los Angeles. So in Los Angeles, that preposition phrase is an adjunct which modifies the seeing of a woman. So these are the two skeleton structures that that languages exploit. And the merge operation, so the merge operation takes two objects and puts them together. And it's a recursive operation, so it can be applied repeatedly. And languages typically have three devices that facilitate recursive merge. One is the use of relative clauses, and that can give us an elaborate expression such as, this is the cow that kicked the dog, that chased the cat, that killed the rat, that caught the mouse, that nibbled the cheese, that lay in the house that Jack built. So it's long, it's complex, but it's not difficult to understand. We use sentences like this to bore young children into sleep, and they understand this readily. A second recursive application of merge is complementation. So this would be stringing together expressions like Ray said, that Kay said, that Jay thought, that Faye said, that Gay told, da 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 da, so on. And the third device is coordination, and you can string things together through conjunctions. Ray and Kay went to the movie, and Jay and Faye to the store, and so on. So these are the structures that underlie all expressions, and that enables us to generate expressions of a wide range. So all European languages have interrogative forms that have an interrogative word which is pronounced at the beginning of the sentence and understood somewhere else. In this case, understood in the strike-through position. So who did we see means what it means. Who is pronounced at the beginning of the clause, and who is not pronounced. That's the sense of strike-through. But it is understood as the complement of the verb see. Alternatively, we might have a similar structure, but where the who is from a position to the right of a preposition. Who did we speak to? Or who did she say left? There, the who is pronounced at the beginning and is understood as the subject of left. So what we're doing here is copying the interrogative word and deleting what we copied. Okay, so the who is copied at the front of the expression and deleted in the position in which it's generated. So that's all well and good, and we can see that there's a range of structures from which these interrogative words may be moved. So that's just fine. However, we also have expressions that do not occur. And when you see red font, what that means for the next hour is does not occur. So who did she say that left? No English speaker would express something along those lines. Whose did she see pictures? Just doesn't occur in English, and the translation doesn't occur in many other languages. And so what we need is a system which will allow these structures to occur, but not allow the red structures in this slide to show up. Furthermore, just to make things more interesting, we can have an English expression like how many did she see cars, which does not occur. The word-for-word translation of that in French, however, is perfectly well formed. Combien a-t-elle-vous de voitures? So what's the difference between French and English such that those expressions occur in English and, occur in French, but not in English? Okay. So we have principles which will sort of authorize or validate the occurring structures and deny the structures which do not occur. And the linguistic genotype, so the genetic material that underlies the language capacity, has a set of principles which do not vary and a set of parameters which do vary. So an example of a principle is that elements may be deleted only in certain sort of prominent positions. The details, they need not concern us, but that's an example guiding where a deletion occurs and where it does not occur. Parameters, on the other hand, are quite different. So two parameters from the early days of parameter theory are given on this slide. So a determiner phrase may precede or follow a verb in a verb phrase. So in English, verbs precede their complements, but in Dutch or German, they follow their complement. So that's an example of a binary parameter saying that the child has the choice between having the verb initial or final. Another parameter deals with locality restrictions. And elements may move, but only locally. And they cannot move across more than one bounding nodes. So the question is, what are the bounding nodes? And that's parameterized. So this is the very first instance of a parameter in the literature and due to the work of Luigi Rizzi. Let's look now at a construction that shows up in English, verb phrase ellipsis. So we can say things like Max left for Rio today and Kim did, whoops. And Kim did as well. Here, the verb phrase is not pronounced, it's ellipsed. And these are two coordinated clauses. One can have a main clause preceding a subordinate clause and say Max left for Rio, although Kim didn't. And again, this is the understood verb phrase, and we understood that to mean leave for Rio. Or we can have the subordinate clause first, the main clause following. Although Max couldn't, ellipsed verb phrase, Kim was able to leave for Rio. One can have ellipsed verb phrases occurring, the ellipsed form occurring in its separate clause from the understood form. So Max went to Rio. Yeah, but Kim didn't, namely go to Rio, and so on. So again, a wide range of structures where these ellipse forms show up, but there are limits. So English and some other languages have a little operation that permute a quantifier like all and an auxiliary verb like had. So they all had read it, or they had all read it. They mean the same, and the order of the words is slightly different. Equally, one can have they denied reading it, although they all had. There, the ellipsed verb phrase is in a position where it's the complement of the adjacent word had, and everything swings, that conforms to the principle that dictates which deletions occur and which don't. However, suppose we use the other order. Instead of all had, we have had all. Now we get something that no English speaker would ever use. They denied reading it, although they had all. It's hard to say, hard to pronounce, but that does not occur. And the reason is that the ellipsed verb phrase is not adjacent to a word of which it completes the meaning. Similarly, they denied reading it, although they often had. There, the deletion is well formed. there's the deleted verb phrase, and it occurs adjacent to the verb which it completes the meaning of. However, if we permute the auxiliary verb and the little adverb often, we get they denied reading it, although they had often, which is impossible, and again, hard to pronounce. So somehow kids figure this stuff out. It's extremely detailed knowledge. They're not taught it because the adults that most kids hang around with don't know these facts in any conscious way. But children learn to behave like other people in terms of the subconscious behavior, and they know where to use the well-formed forms and where not to use the ill-formed forms. So what I want to focus attention on this afternoon is variation, variable properties, and the acquisition. And minimalist thinking has done many wonderful things, but it's really cast no new light on the nature of what constitutes variable properties and how they are acquired. So we're going to pay attention to that and see what would be involved in coming to understand variation and the acquisition of variable properties better. So we have no biologically coherent general approach to variable properties or how they're acquired. And linguists are even worse at this because we study variable properties in silos. Some of us think in terms of parameters, some think in terms of variable rules, some think in terms of constraint re-ranking, and minimalists largely ignore these things. So the success that we've had with parameters comes nowhere near the success that we've had with invariant properties. So that's variable properties. Parameters are in even worse shape. We have no real theory of parameters. Sometimes linguists will talk about the Borer-Chomsky conjecture as if that provides a theory of parameters, namely the parameters are linked to particular kinds of functional properties. We have virtually no discussion about how parameters are set. Genuinely binary parameters are very few. Sometimes it's said that the triggers for elements of internal languages are what those elements serve to generate, but that's circular. And in recent years, there's been a lot of attention paid to what are called micro parameters. So these are elements dealing with small properties of languages, and they're defined at the level of universal grammar. And the problem with defining any parameters at the level of universal grammar is that they add to the detail of what's in universal grammar. If universal grammar contains a set of micro parameters, that violates the aspirations of minimalists and constitutes a problem. So given those problems, it's tempting to say there is no variation. And Chomsky actually postulated this about 20 years ago in what he called the uniformity hypothesis, which said that in the absence of compelling evidence to the contrary, assume languages to be uniform, with variety restricted to easily detected properties of utterances. Under that view, we all speak human. And then the question is, how do we implement that? How do we show that expressions of Japanese, Quechua, French are stated in a common language, namely human, how can that be implemented? Well, we'll get some sense of that as we go along this afternoon, because I'm going to argue for something roughly along those lines. So the basic property of languages is that they are formed in the way that I've indicated by those skeletal structures. So that's the base, what Chomsky has called the basic property of language. The basic property of humans, the people who use these languages, is that they parse. So fish swim, birds fly, and human children are born to parse. That's a property of human beings and not of fish or birds. So under this view, parsing is central, and children invent new variable properties through a discovery process. And here we have an interplay between two notions that it's important to understand. These are notions that go back 30 or 40 years. There's language as an external phenomenon. One can talk about the language that's used in the Abraleen lecture series. But then individuals have a biological organ which enables them to express thoughts in the way that we do. So children are exposed to external language. They parse that external language, that is to say, they assign structure to it. And I language results from the parsing. So the particular language organ has the properties that it has as a result of the parsing of external language. However, the approach that we're taking to parsing is not the one that's standard. We are not postulating a parser. The parsing mechanism is the internal language. That's the mechanism by which structures are assigned to expressions. So people parse by assigning structures that are made available by their emerging internal language. That is to say, what exists in universal grammar, plus the early learning that takes place in the first few years of life. So we have this distinction between external language, internal languages, and parsing. So children parse external language and postulate specific I language elements that are required for aspects of that parse. The aggregation of elements constitutes the complete I language. When E language, external language, shifts, when that changes in ways that we'll see in a moment, children may parse differently and thus attain or invent a new internal language. And we see this occurring as we study instances of syntactic change in the history of French or Quechua or Japanese. Children invent variable properties of their internal languages through parsing. There's no evaluation of internal languages, and there are no binary parameters. And universal grammar is open, but some things are learned. That's consistent with an open universal grammar. And under that approach to things, we can define learning paths. So children can determine whether a grammar has verb object order or object verb order. Children cannot do that until they have identified phrasal categories and know that verb object is a verb phrase. So representations are elaborated step by step in the course of acquisition, and the structures needed become increasingly abstract and grammar internal. So the learning path is part of linguistic theory. It's a function of the way in which the structures are stated, and that notion is due to important work by Ilan Drescher from 20 odd years ago. So let's look a little bit more carefully at parsing. So the cat sat on the mat has the structure that I've indicated here. The cat, we have a determiner preceding a noun. The determiner and the cat have been merged into a determiner phrase. Similarly, sit plus past is merged with on the mat. Okay, and so this is the parse, which is formed through the two operations that we started out with. So the child discovers structures and categories that are needed for the parse, using what internal language makes available to analyze their ambient external language. Kids learn irregular past tenses, plurals, and learn that past verb followed by a preposition phrase is a structure. It's this structure, sat on the mat. And this is done through distributional analysis, looking at the way in which verbs, prepositions, and so on are distributed in the syntax. And these structures resulting from parsing make up the emerging internal language. So an internal language is a biological entity. Individuals develop their own private internal language, building on genetically prescribed principles, and with its elements triggered by the ambient external language. Internal languages are quite different from external language. Internal languages are discrete, biological entities, finite, but they range over an infinitude of recursively enumerable structures. They're represented in people's brains and generating expressions and their structures. And it's perfectly possible that no two I languages are identical, that there are so many points of differences that an individual's internal language may in fact be unique. External language, on the other hand, is not a biological system. It's a mass sociological notion. It's amorphous, it's not a system, it's in constant flux and appears differently to different children, and it's not recursively enumerable. So we can get new parses, and new external language may yield new parses. And internal languages may differ minimally. The parallelism of the changes reflects the singularity of internal language difference. So I want to look at 4 new parses that have taken place in the history of English and to see how we can understand them. So there's a bunch of words in modern English: can, could, must, may, and there's about 10 or a dozen of these verbs that used to be in early English, in Old English or early Middle English. They used to be verbs. But in the 15th century, they were reanalyzed by children initially, such that those verbs became something other than verbs. They became inflectional elements. They were no longer verbs. And that new syntax was manifested. So there's the structural difference. In early English, Kim can visit London. Can is a verb. In later English, can is an inflection element projecting to an inflection phrase. Kim can visit London. The result of that is that in very early English, all of this, that the black and red expressions were well formed. He has seen stars, or he could see stars. He could see stars does not exist in modern English, but it used to occur. Seeing stars, she looked for planets, but not canning see stars, she looked for planets. That is to say, not in modern English, but that's perfectly well formed in early English, and so on. All of these red forms dropped out of the language at the same time. So they became obsolete. That was the change, and we can understand why that change took place. So the singularity in I language explains the simultaneity of the phenomena. So there's a bunch of phenomena that are changing here. It's the red forms that cease to occur. The black forms are good at both the early and later stages of English. So there's a single change in the system. The I language verbs, some of them became inflection elements. But why did this happen? Well, there's only one way that this can happen under the view that we've sketched, and that is because children encounter new external language, which entails new internal languages. So there's an intimate relationship between external language and internal languages, although they are quite different kinds of entities. So Old English was a very complex system with many different forms. So this is a few verbs from Old English, and these are different forms that occur depending on whether it's a past tense verb or present tense, whether the subject is singular or plural, and so on. And the verb form changes depending on how it's understood. Well, that's all well and good, and there were hundreds of morphological operations in early English, but most of this got lost under Scandinavian influence. So the earliest forms without the morphological endings occurred in the northeast of the country where the Scandinavians were living. So one feature of this is that verbs that have no S ending were nothing special in the old days. But it became special once the endings had become many fewer. So now the verbs with no inflectional endings, the so-called inflectional elements, become distinctive. Okay, and so that happens because sorry. Sorry about this. So the external language changed under influence of the Scandinavians, and that led to new I languages, new internal languages, in which can became an inflectional element and no longer a verb. So the second new parse is one where the red forms on this slide cease to occur. The black forms were introduced into the language again in the 14th, 15th century. And as the black forms, which we call the periphrastic do forms, as they became established, so the red forms became obsolete, dropped out of the language. So we don't need the details of these morphological structures, but the fact is that verbs in English cease to move to a high inflection position, whereas in every other, well, almost every other European language, that change did not take place. Here's, I think, my favorite syntactic change. So Old English, Gora ne lucada na heora geliflist. Goda is the dative, to God, licada, modern liked, na not, their faithlessness. Their faithlessness is a nominative case. That's the subject of the verb licada. And what that means is that God didn't like their faithlessness. But these case endings, again under Scandinavian influence, were lost beginning in the Northeast. And so children at a certain point did not have case endings. So how could they parse these structures? Well, they parsed them very differently. So this affected like 40 or 50 verbs that are called psychological verbs that have dative experiencer. And like meant to please in Old English, but it came to mean in modern English, enjoy. So if God is to become the subject of this clause, then the meaning of like has to change. And that happened. And people at the time would not have been aware of this. They would have continued to communicate normally and all would be well. So there we have a third new parse. Here's another interesting one. The expression, take the expression, Kim slept well and Jim will too. So there's an understood verb here. Jim will sleep too, okay? However, Kim was here and Jim will too. No modern speaker of English would talk that way. It would have to be Kim was here and Jim will be too, okay? Jane Austen, however, was one of the last writers to use these forms, and she could say things like, I wish our opinions were the same, but in time they will. For modern English speakers, that needs to be, but in time they will be, okay? And so the change in, this is 19th century English, is that was could not be analyzed as be plus past in the way that slept is analyzed as sleep plus past. Okay. So again, new I languages dealing with very detailed aspects of the language, but we can understand how they occurred. So there's 4 cases from English where we can understand why there was a structural shift due to a prior shift in the external language. This raises the prospect of a construction that has bedeviled Chinese syntacticians for generations. There's pretty good reason, which I'm certainly not going to give you, but there's pretty good reason to believe that ba constructions in early Chinese were serial verbs, but in modern Chinese, they are light verbs. Again, the details need not concern us. That's a change that took place. Under the approach that we're taking here, the explanation for that can only be that this is a response to new e-language, new external language. What that is, I don't have the faintest idea, but I've been talking with Chinese syntacticians and there are ideas out there, and hopefully that will get elaborated over time. So English is an unusual language and it has several properties that don't show up in neighboring languages. So some of them we've talked about here. So treating can in French is pouvoir or devoir, must. These things are verbs, but in English they are inflection elements, and that turns out to be a unique property of English. the man from LA's speech to us. We have this kind of clitic form in modern English. And that's just part of the language. This book was talked about. That's a stranded preposition. The book is understood here. And so the preposition is stranded. Kim has been to Paris. That is not analyzed as was plus past. So there are several properties that English speakers have introduced into the language, variable properties that have been invented, such that there's no language similar to English, comparable to the way in which Dutch and German are similar to each other. Italian and Spanish, Thai and Lao are similar to each other. Dutch and German speakers can understand each other to a degree. So children have acquired these special variable properties. They use these structures that are expressed by the external language they hear. By expressed, what I mean is that they're required for the analysis of what the child is hearing. The set of structures used constitutes the mature internal language, and universal grammar is open. And so part of my claim is that we have over-theorized the limits on variable properties by saying that they're due to binary parameters. That's not the way that variable properties are distributed in the modern language. So there are no binary UG defined parameters, no global evaluation of grammars. Kids parse the ambient external language and invent those English internal languages have developed unique properties that are not shared with neighboring languages. So we need an approach to variation that makes this understandable. And the view that I'm advocating here is that external language shifts that can lead to new parses, and that in turn entails new internal languages. And meanwhile, universal grammar is open. It's consistent with a lot of variation within the internal language. Okay. So one of the problems with parameters is that they seem to be biologically weird. There's nothing like parameters elsewhere. Let's get rid of the sharing. There's nothing like parameters elsewhere in the biological world. However, I think there's a possibility now of understanding these variable properties differently and understanding the way in which they're acquired. But recent work by evolutionary biologists suggests that there are changes in biology which will facilitate a coming together of this approach to linguistics and comparable work within biology. So Darwin, at several points in The Origin of Species, laments the fact that he had never seen a new species emerge. And he was very disturbed by that. And he felt that it ought to be the case that he should be able to observe new species, whereas he had not been able to do that and nobody else had. Well, in recent work on what are now called Darwin's finches, the finches of the Galapagos Islands turn out to have different shaped beaks. And the result of this is that work by Rosemary and Peter Grant, the evolutionary biologists who have done this crucial work on Darwin's finches, they have shown that there are 13 different species of finch on the Galapagos Islands. And each of these species lives on different islands and eats different sorts of seeds. And over the course of time, natural selection has generated appropriate shaped beaks such that the finches on those islands can eat the seeds that are available on that island. So we see natural selection actually in progress here. And so what I'm suggesting is that, so for the grants, the genetic material is open. So it's consistent with the beaks of all 13 of these subspecies of finch. In much the same way that I've argued this afternoon, that that universal grammar is open, consistent with many different biological forms. So if we think in that way, then the work that linguists are doing from this perspective is not totally dissimilar from work carried out by evolutionary biologists. So these are, to my mind, interesting ideas worth pursuing. It involves rethinking variable properties, their nature, and how they are acquired. And I look forward to seeing productive work by linguists who have worked on parameters and now will be working, hopefully, on different ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's a great talk. It's always a great pleasure to listen to you. Thank you. We have a couple of questions here, and I also have some questions. It's an amazing topic, and you know it's very important also to people who are looking at language from the perspective of animal communication in general. It's very interesting. So let me ask you the questions we have here right now. So we have a question by Stephanie da Cruz Santiago. I think he's from UFBA, Bahia. And he said, David, in this way, the lexical units are taking a more important role in the generative enterprise, since the merge proposition seems to be based on the union of lexical units.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, it's not only lexical units, or elements of structure, and these are the elements that get merged. So that's the language system. It's these things put together. So the cat sat on the mat, right? The and cat are merged at some point, and the cat is merged with sat. Yeah, in some cases it's words that are getting merged, but it's really structures, of which words are one example.
Thank you. Now let me see who else have a question here. Janaína Carvalho from UFMG, Belo Horizonte, Minas Gerais. She asked, in the absence of parameters, what could explain the several languages said to be marked for the same parameter display similar properties? For example, as VS order, no referential subjects, no expletives.
But you've got to look at these properties carefully. So there's a whole industry generated by the introduction of parameters. There's a whole industry on null subjects, right? So null subjects are sentences like rains, where there's no word in that subject position. But when you look at, well, there's work by, let's stay with Brazilian Portuguese. There's work on null subjects in Brazilian, which has changed over the course of time from the 19th century onwards. And your former colleague at Maryland, Acricio Pires, has done very interesting work on this. And it turns out that everybody's null subject language is different. That may be something of an exaggeration. But But we can see, I mean, I gave you 4 cases in the history of English, where the innovation is very particular structures that are invented by children.
Right, so now I have a question from someone who is not a Brazilian, I guess. Fafali, I guess.
You can always try.
Please, could you say more about iLanguage? How different can they be from one another? Are there any limits? Yes.
Well, yes, sure, there are limits. All internal languages need to conform to the invariant principles of universal grammar. So that imposes limits right off. To what degree can languages vary? I don't know how to quantify that, but there are languages of many different types. There's a lot of interesting work done these days on Creole languages. And again, there's a wide range of structures that show up there.
Yes, that would be one of my questions. How do you deal with that? I think that the notional parameters, the thing that you have a finite set of parameters were considered, because then you can explain why languages, they vary among themselves, but they do not vary in a wildly way, right?
Yes, that's correct. And so there are different visions here. And the parameters vision says that you're going to have languages will not vary very much. So there's even speculation that there might only be 30 or 40 parameters, points of variation. And so that would be a dramatic limitation on what's going to count as a well-formed language, right? However, even that is more complex than it seems. If there are 30 independent binary parameters, okay, just multiply that up. That's going to give just over 1 billion different iLanguages, assuming that the parameters are independent. Okay. If there are 40 different parameters, it's going to be 1 trillion. Okay, and the numbers go up astronomically. Now, part of what I didn't talk about this in the talk, although there was a slide that I skipped over quickly. One of the approaches to the acquisition of these parameterized systems is that is to quantify the degree to which one system can generate well-formed expressions. Okay. The problem is that for each of those languages, so now we've got, let's say, 1 billion, for each of those languages, each of them can generate an indefinite number of expressions. Okay. And if we were going to compare 1 billion of those grammars, the numbers are astronomical. And the implicit claims that we're making about the memory is that the child has to store the inventory of expressions that the child has experienced. Okay, I leave that thought with you. That should give you nightmares for a week or so.
That's right. Oh, I have to dream a lot to give a good answer to that.
Yeah.
So you were a lucky one. You just got a question from Jairo Nunes from
Ah, wonderful. Okay, I have a question for Jairo before he gets to ask his question. He's heard this before. So we brought a bunch of Brazilian students to Maryland. Not one of them was a competent football player.
I tried.
They don't do linguistics. Okay, Jairo
never tried. That's right. He never tried. So he says, David, could you please elaborate a bit more on the born to parse property from an evolutionary point of view?
Oh, could I elaborate on that? Yeah, whether or not I can say anything sensible is another question. I mean, it's a great mystery as to how the language faculty evolved in the species. There used to be a regulation for the Linguistic Society of Paris. In 1866, they banned discussion of this topic and said no papers could be given at that society. And there's a lot of nonsense being written about the evolution of language, but we do think we know that this development took place not long ago in evolutionary terms. I mean, maybe 100,000 years, but not 5 million years. So at some point there was a mutation, and the species that developed this language faculty, which basically I think has a lot of misleading talk about the role of this faculty for communication. I think what's important about this, what's most important about these systems, is that they enable the externalization of thought. So by using words like this or using sign languages, if you and I had a different upbringing, yeah. Yes, sorry.
I have a, can I ask a follow-up question on this? Another possible variation is by looking at Chomsky hierarchy of grammars, types of grammars. So maybe within the primate order, we do have language or grammars, but they are not complex as the grammars we have, right? So maybe there is another dimension of variation that we can consider when we look at evolution. So the work, for example, from Philip Schlenker on monkey calls, on vocalizations, they lead us to, especially his work with Zuber-Biller, leads us to think that there is a grammar, but it's not a grammar as power as ours in terms of as expressing thoughts.
Okay, but presumably the mutation which took place involves the properties of our systems. So our ancestors, were able to use these systems, and that was the evolution, that mutation, which showed up in certain people and then spread through the population.
Yes.
Okay, how that happened, why that happened, I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do have a recommendation. The book by Chomsky and Berwick on the evolution of language has attracted quite a lot of attention. And there's a very good paleoanthropologist, Ian Tattersall, who has reviewed that book and written a lot on the evolution of language, among various other things. And I recommend that work, and I think that will be congenial reading for linguists.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Let me see if I have other questions here. So, have another one. Professor David Lightfoot, what parameters could be in play universally for most of the nominative morphology case marker lost with time and space?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
I think he's asking about nominative loss of nominative morphology in languages.
Well, I'd
kind of-
love to know what goes on with morphology. I mean, why is this part of the language faculty?
Yeah.
I mean, one can get away with it. One can get away without these properties. You know, speak some form of modern Chinese. There's very little morphology there. So it's not something which is indispensable for the language faculty.
Right. So people from Feira de Santana, Bahia, they want me to say hi to you. They're very
Ah,
happy you there.
okay, very good. Yes, we had conversations when was it? Several months ago, which was very, very interesting.
Can I ask you some personal questions? Not not personal. No, that's not what I mean. Some of my questions. I have some questions to you. One of them is, given that there are no parameters, how could we deal with in this view of yours, like in this new view of yours, how do you deal with pidgin situations, creation of Creole languages, for example?
How do I deal with them?
Pidgin
Well,
situations, yes.
well, pigeons, okay, if we take the usual definition that the difference between a pigeon and a Creole is that a Creole is a natural language, whereas a pigeon is some earlier version of what presumably in time might become a Creole language. But I mean, again, there's extremely interesting work being done on Creoles. I think particularly of the work of Enoch Abo in Amsterdam. And I think he and I would share quite a lot in terms of seeing children as parsing what they hear and analyzing it. I mean, that's the whole idea of parsing, that you ascribe categories to words and so forth.
But when you have a pidgin situation, it's likely that the environment, that e-language is very unstable, right? You have
Yes.
children having more than one input. So how do they deal with that and turn out that they will have AI language at the end?
Well, let's be careful. I'm not sure that Creole speakers have any prerogative in this regard. I mean, this is true of all of us. We are exposed to different I languages, and we invent the categories that we need through the parsing process. So I would treat this the same way, but I would recognize that treating that by starting with pidgin languages is going to be very difficult.
Yes, let me see another one here. The idea that I got it that you're not positing the difference between the grammar and the parser, right?
No, on the contrary, the grammar is the parser. I mean, it does various things, but one of the things it does is it enables the user to analyze what's being experienced.
That's right. So, but as I understand it, one of the dilemmas of treating the grammar as the parser is that we do have a problem in terms of top-down derivation and bottom-up derivation, right? So while the parse process information in a top-down fashion, the grammar will do it in a bottom-up fashion. And that's, I think, is one of the problems with Colin Phillips' work. That's why he probably abandoned the project of treating the grammar, the parser, as the grammar.
Okay, well, I would want to rethink the idea of what it means to be a top-down or bottom-up process. right? So we have a way now, I mean, the way in which merge is usually thought of is as a bottom-up process. Well, what's that going to mean if what we're doing is assigning structures to expressions that we experience? So I don't know.
Yeah, no, but that's very interesting, and it's really interesting.
I mean, these are mechanisms, right? And remember why we write these internal languages. I mean, it's a way of characterizing the subconscious knowledge that we have. And so, we formulate merge to operate as it does, so that it enables us to assign structures to the beginnings of English or Brazilian or Quechua, whatever it's going to be.
Thank you, David. Let me see if I have any other question.
So the questions that you're posing, Selena, are all very interesting, right? What I'm suggesting, I mean, the basic point of the book and of the lecture this afternoon is that we need to do a better job of thinking about variable properties, their nature and how they're acquired. And really, with all due respect to the Minimalist program and to the generative tradition which predates the Minimalist program, we've been extremely successful in discovering invariant properties. But the track record of parameters in particular is not very good. And I think we need to be looking for new ways of thinking about it. And I think the work of the biologists gives us a hand. I mean, here's a way of thinking about variation in a way that is consistent with our understanding of new properties showing up in these birds on the Galapagos Islands.
Yeah.
So maybe that can be usefully analogized to, thinking of the change in the history of English when certain words became recategorized, formerly verbs and latterly as inflection items.
Yeah, I think for us, the Brazilians, this talk is interesting, especially because many of us are interested in the null subject parameter.
Sure.
But now we do have this notion of partial null subject parameter or partial null. What is it actually, right? We all talk about it and we all talk about a partial null subject parameter, but what exactly is a partial null subject parameter?
Well, I don't know.
It's not, yes, exactly. It's not so easy to define, especially if you think that parameters were thought as binary properties. Right now they're not binary anymore.
Right. So one of the things I was trying to convey this afternoon is what it's going to mean to work in terms of a new paradigm, right? So somebody committed to parameters will look at the question you've just put differently from somebody who's thinking in terms of parsing. So the person who's committed to parameters, binary or not, is going to look for commonalities, look for parallel changes, for example, in different languages that can all be characterized as a new parameter setting. Whereas from my point of view, the point of view of what I've advocated this afternoon, that's not where I'm going to look. That's not what I expect the world to be. I expect the world to be richer in the sense that the range of variation that we're going to experience is wider, but it can still be understood. I mean, these weird properties of changes in the syntax of the verb be, right? So that we can understand Jane Austen's speech differently. That's intriguing, right? And that has to be explained. I mean, well, it has to be explained. I mean, that's one of the things that one would want to explain. And so, but one would come to that with a different vision from the parameter enthusiasts.
Yes. So Michelle de Graaf, hi Michelle, and is here saying, I totally agree with David Lightfoot, and that's not that there is nothing exceptional about the nature of the primary linguistic data in the Creole information. That's the main point of the Abo and de Graaf's paper.
Yes, I mean, and Michelle has done a lot of work on this over decades, and this is what I would subscribe to.
Yes.
I mean, the difference between parameters and parsing at that level is pretty abstract. But to treat Creoles as natural languages, subject to the usual principles or the usual parsing operations, in my case, right? That's what we should be doing.
Right. Any more questions? No, I think it's over. I can follow you here. Listen to this. Recursion. Oh, this is not working. My recursion is not really working. Here, recursion.
Oh, okay.
All right, thanks everybody. But before we really say thank you and we leave Zoom, I want to go back to our issue about our native languages and the fact that we're going through a very hard time right now. And the native people of Brazil and South American in general are going through a very, very hard time. So Abralin is doing a very good work in creating a fund to help these people during the COVID times. So I wish that all of us could help. And if you can, please go to the Abralin webpage and follow the link to the COVID fund and help us if you can. It's really important. Without these people, we cannot do linguistics. Right?
Well, that's right. We sort of cut ourselves off from richer, more complex possibilities by not valuing these languages. And it's not a matter of valuing the languages, it's a matter of valuing the speakers, the people who use those languages. And I've admired Michel de Graaf's work for a long time in the way in which he has argued that case. So it's where our work as linguists comes together with our, well, frankly, with our politics.
Yes. Yes, so please help if you can. It's really important right now. Thank you. Thank you, David. Thanks for everything. Graças a la vida, as we say here in South America, really. It's really a pleasure to know you and get in contact with your work. Thank you.
Thank you. The pleasure has been mine.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.